The Kamau family lived in an upscale neighborhood in Nairobi, a grand house surrounded by high walls and lush gardens. Inside, the home was filled with expensive furniture, modern appliances, and the laughter of three young children: Amoni, Wanjiru, and little Kato. Mr. and Mrs. Kamau were hard-working business owners, constantly juggling meetings, travel, and long work hours. Though they loved their children dearly, their busy schedules meant they had little time to watch over them. They needed a trustworthy housemaid, someone who would care for their children as their own. Mrs. Kamau had been searching for months. Many women applied for the position, but none seemed right. Some were too young and inexperienced, others too old to handle three active children. Then, one day, a well-dressed woman arrived at their gate, holding a small bag. Her name was Mama Tasha. She was a tall, broad-shouldered woman with dark skin and a sharp gaze. She wore a simple blue dress and a headscarf, and she spoke with the soft, polite tone of a well-trained housemaid. "I have been taking care of children for over 15 years," she told Mrs. Kamau. "I cook, I clean, and I know how to discipline children when necessary." Something about her seemed firm yet trustworthy. She was older, perhaps in her late 40s, and carried herself with confidence. "Discipline?" Mrs. Kamau repeated, slightly raising an eyebrow. Mama Tasha smiled. "Of course, madam. Children must be well behaved, especially when their parents are not around. But I never raise my hand on a child. I use wisdom." Reassured, Mrs. Kamau hired her on the spot. The salary was generous, the living quarters comfortable, and the responsibilities simple: cleaning, cooking, and looking after the children. The children were cautious around the new maid at first. Amoni, at 10, was observant. Wanjiru, 8, was friendly but hesitant. Little Kato, only 4, clung to his mother and refused to let Mama Tasha hold him. "She will take good care of you," Mrs. Kamau assured them, patting Kato's head. "Be good children, and she will love you." If only she had known the monster she had just invited into her home. At first, Mama Tasha was the perfect housemaid. She woke up early, prepared breakfast, and kept the house spotless. She even helped Amoni and Wanjiru with their homework. To Mr. and Mrs. Kamau, she was a blessing. But when the parents left for work, her true colors began to show. The first sign was the sudden shift in her tone. When Mr. and Mrs. Kamau were around, she was soft-spoken and gentle. But once the door closed behind them, her voice turned sharp, her eyes cold. "Sit down," she snapped one morning when Kato spilled his milk. The boy, shocked, quickly obeyed. At first, Amoni and Wanjiru thought she was just strict. But it didn't take long for them to realize she was much worse than that. Mama Tasha was cruel. She made them do chores far beyond their abilities. Amoni was forced to scrub floors until his hands turned red. Wanjiru had to wash heavy laundry under the scorching sun. Kato, too small for chores, was often locked in a room alone for hours. She didn't just give orders, she punished. If Wanjiru was too slow with the laundry, she yanked her hair. If Amoni missed a spot while mopping, she slapped the back of his head. Kato, the youngest, suffered the worst. If he cried, she pinched his tiny arms until bruises formed. "Your parents are not here to save you," she sneered. "If you tell them anything, I will say you are lying. Then they will send you to the village, and you will suffer." Fear gripped the children. The village was their worst nightmare, a place with no toys, no comfortable beds, and no love. They knew of relatives who mistreated children left in their care, and so they kept silent. But the worst was yet to come. One of Mama Tasha's favorite ways to torment the children was through food. Despite living in a house filled with delicious meals, she made sure they barely got enough to eat. She locked the kitchen cabinets and kept the keys around her neck. At meal times, she ate first, heaping her plate with steaming rice, juicy meat, and fresh fruit while the children watched hungrily. "Good children eat what they are given," she said, tossing them a few dry slices of bread and a cup of weak tea. One evening, Amani was so hungry that he sneaked into the kitchen to take some leftovers. Just as he reached for a piece of chapati, a sharp slap landed on his back. "Deef," Mama Tasha hissed. She dragged him by the ear and forced him to kneel on the cold tile floor, with his hands raised. "If you put your hands down, I will make you kneel on salt," she warned. Amani, crying, obeyed. Wanjiru and Kato were too scared to help. They knew what would happen if they did. They lived in constant fear. Every day felt like a prison sentence. But fate has a way of punishing the wicked. Mrs. Kamau had always prided herself on being a good mother. Even with her busy schedule, she made time to check on her children, ask about their day, and ensure they were happy and well cared for. But lately, something felt off. At first, it was subtle little changes that could have been brushed off as ordinary childhood moods. Amani, once full of energy, now preferred to stay quiet, staring at nothing in particular. Wanjiru, usually eager to chat about school and her friends, had become nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting trouble. And little Kato, her cheerful, giggling boy, had changed the most. He no longer ran to greet her when she came home. Instead, he clung to corners, his big eyes filled with a fear she couldn't understand. The first real warning came when she noticed that her children had become thinner. One evening, as she was tucking Kato into bed, she felt his ribs beneath his pajama shirt. Frowning, she placed a gentle hand on his belly. It was flatter than it should have been, almost hollow. "Kato, are you eating well?" she asked softly. The boy hesitated. His tiny fingers curled around his blanket. "Yes, Mama," he whispered, but his voice was weak. Doubt flickered through her mind. The next morning, Mrs. Kamau observed breakfast carefully. Mama Tasha prepared a large plate for herself: eggs, sausages, toast, and tea. But when she served the children, their plates had nothing but plain porridge. Amani stared at his food without a word. Wanjiru forced a few spoonfuls into her mouth, chewing slowly. Kato barely touched his. Mrs. Kamau frowned. "Mama Tasha," she said, keeping her tone light, "why aren't the children eating the same food as you?" The maid chuckled. "Ah, madam, you know children. If I give them heavy food in the morning, they won't eat their lunch." Mrs. Kamau nodded but remained unconvinced. That evening, she told her husband about her concerns. "I don't know, dear," she admitted. "I just feel something isn't right. The children are different. They're quieter, thinner, and Kato seems so scared all the time." Mr. Kamau sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe they're just adjusting to school. Or maybe they miss us. You know we've been so busy lately." Mrs. Kamau wanted to believe that was the case, but deep in her heart, a mother's instinct told her something far worse was happening. The final sign came a few days later when she noticed bruises on Wanjiru's arms. It was bath time, and Mrs. Kamau had just finished helping Kato into his pajamas when she heard Wanjiru yelp from the bathroom. Rushing in, she found her daughter rubbing her upper arm, trying to hide a dark purple bruise. "What happened?" Mrs. Kamau asked, kneeling beside her. Wanjiru's face paled. "The eye fell." Mrs. Kamau's stomach twisted. She gently took her daughter's hand and examined the bruise. It was too round, too deliberate. It looked like a pinch. A hard, cruel pinch. Her heart pounded. Something was terribly, terribly wrong, and she was going to find out exactly what it was. Mrs. Kamau knew she needed proof before confronting Mama Tasha. If she accused the maid without evidence, the woman might deny everything, making it harder to expose the truth. So she devised a plan. The following morning, she told Mama Tasha that she and Mr. Kamau would be leaving for an important meeting in the afternoon and wouldn't be home until late. "We're trusting you to take good care of the children," she said with a warm smile. Mama Tasha returned the smile, bowing slightly. "Of course, madam. You know you can count on me. But Mrs. Kamau had no intention of going anywhere. Instead, she parked her car a few streets away and quietly walked back to the house. She entered through the back door, careful not to make any noise. She moved cautiously down the hallway, listening. The first sound she heard was Mama Tasha's sharp voice. "Hurry up and finish washing those plates, Amoni. Do you think I have all day?" Then came a muffled Wimpicato's voice. Mrs. Kamau's heart clenched. She stepped closer to the kitchen and peered inside. The sight before her made her blood run cold. Mama Tasha had Cato by the arm, yanking him so hard that his feet barely touched the floor. On the table in front of her was a full plate of food, but Cato's plate was empty. "You are spoiled," Mama Tasha sneered. "Go and drink water if you're hungry." Cato sniffled, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Auntie." Mrs. Kamau felt rage bubble up inside her. She had seen enough. "Mama Tasha." The woman froze. Slowly, she turned, her face draining of color as she saw Mrs. Kamau standing in the doorway, fury burning in her eyes. There was no escape. At that moment, Amoni and Wanju ran into the kitchen, eyes wide with shock and relief. "Mama," they cried, running to her side. Sobbing, they began to spill everything: the beatings, the starvation, the threats, every terrible detail. Tears filled Mrs. Kamau's eyes as she hugged her children. Then she turned back to Mama Tasha, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you lay a hand on my children?" Mama Tasha opened her mouth to lie, but before she could, Mr. Kamau walked in. He had heard everything. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and called the police. "Sir, please let me explain," Mama Tasha began. "Shut your mouth," Mr. Kamau snapped. "You will explain yourself to the police." Minutes later, the police arrived. They handcuffed Mama Tasha, ignoring her cries for mercy. As they dragged her out of the house, neighbors gathered outside, whispering in shock. News spread quickly. Other families came forward with similar stories. It turned out that Mama Tasha had worked in many homes before, and in every home, she had left behind terrified, broken children. But now, justice had caught up with her. She was sentenced 2 years in prison, and for the first time, she experienced the same suffering she had inflicted on others. Meanwhile, the Kamau household slowly healed. Amoni and Wanjuru smiled again. Cato, no longer afraid, returned to being the playful child he once was. And Mrs. Kamau, she never ignored her instincts again, because the cries of children never go unheard, and the wicked always get what they deserve.